It's time to get the inside info on BYU with Cougar insider Mitch Harper of KSLSports.com on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
Doug Smith brings you this portion of the program. An incredible selection of Kia, Subaru, Chevy, Jeep, Dodge, or Ram, and now Mitsubishi at the dealerships in American Fork, Spanish Fork, and in Linden is where you can find the folks at Doug Smith. Nobody knows cars like Doug. Mitch Harper. Nobody knows the Cougs like Mitch Harper, and that's a definite. Mitch, we got lots going on here in the state. Of course, some guys here locally who are committed to play at the local teams, playing in these state championship games, and you're out in Cincinnati. Have you tried the Skyline Chili? I remember being in Cincinnati one time and being like, I'm a fat dude, but listen, I don't know about spaghetti with chili on top. I mean, that sounds like already a disaster. If you're in the hotel room by yourself, it works out. But any Skyline Chili sighting so far for you?
No Skyline Chili for me so far. I did see it at the airport and thought to myself, maybe I should stop and get some before I head out. But
airport Skyline Chili, I would recommend it. I would go against it. I don't know.
But I have not had any Skyline Chili. I will say this, though. Just dreary skies. What you would expect out here in Cincinnati.
Oh, yeah.
That's what it is. It's been gloomy. Even the local TV broadcast here, they're just saying how they're already done with these dreary skies. It's supposed to have a little bit of morning showers on Saturday for the big noon kickoff, but should be cleared up on Saturday night, which is good. But big game this weekend here in Cincy.
We've had a lot to discuss, obviously, this week with the Big 12 and the breaking news, of course, that we were wondering when this was going to happen because they need to get these wheels going down at Baylor. But Mac Rhodes, it's being reported by Pete Thamel, he's going to be officially out, and that, of course, will lead to the likelihood of Dave Aranda being officially out. But what a mess down at Baylor. That's a team that is reeling, of course. They got their butts handed to them last weekend. That was probably almost a foregone conclusion before that thing happened. But, man, the blow-up down there at Baylor was swift, and it was also even more messy than we thought it was going to be because we thought that Dave Aranda might be short time down there in Waco.
Well, it just highlights, too, how quick things can change in college football. And it feels like with Aranda it's been a little bit longer opportunity for him than most coaches, but things can turn in a hurry. You can go from being one of the hottest teams in the Big 12 a year ago to now looks like it's an athletic department that needs a complete reset. So that's just what college sports are. So like when you think you've arrived, it can turn in a hurry, and that's what we saw out east with Penn State and James Franklin, and then he ends the year at Virginia Tech. This sport, every single game takes on such a intensity and with so much money on the line each and every game, and then when you add off the field issues that were reported with Mac Rhodes, it makes it's a high stakes deal in college football these days, and I think it's intense for all involved, and I think for Baylor they need a complete reset.
Mitch, how much interest, if any, do you think there will be, whether it's a possibility or not, for some of these schools to have interest in guys like Kalani or Jay Hill to fill their vacancies?
Well, I look at if there was the Baylor job open, I think you take a page from Texas Tech if you're Baylor to try to get a Texas high school guy that can build relationships and have a robust NIL, and Kalani and Jay Hill don't fit that billing. The Colorado State job I think is interesting if you're a Jay Hill, but at the same time, that's the Pac-12. It's not the Big 12 and power conferences, and I did say BYU's got more resources than a Colorado State. And I think also, too, what's interesting about Jay Hill's situation at BYU is just that, if there was ever a time where Kalani did look at another job, Jay Hill's the guy that would be the perfect just to step right up and be the next in line. And I think, because that pull for BYU's head coach position, it's very limited still.
Yeah.
And, Jay Hill would be outstanding, and I think that's always appealing. And I think that, he's really settled in quite well at BYU to where Kalani gives him complete autonomy over his defense, over the way he recruits. You see it with some of these players out Utah high school championship games. He's formed a lot of great relationships with these guys. Judy Mwala from Orem High, who we'll see tonight. He's one of the fastest risers this year in high school football. He's now a 4-star recruit. heavily involved there. He's recruiting at a high level at BYU, and I think it's only just scratching the surface for the Cougars, what they're doing. So, and he even said as much, a couple weeks ago when I asked him about some of these personnel and what he's building. He feels like they're only going to get better personnel-wise in future years. So there's been a lot invested into building out this defense. So I'd like to think that Jay Hill would want to stay. But, if there was a power conference job that came open and actually pursued him and had, the resources and the NIL commitment that would, make him, he'd have to probably listen, because I'm sure he wants to eventually be a head coach again, I would imagine. But he's also said, too, consistently that he doesn't just take jobs to immediately leave. We saw that at Weber State, and I think at BYU he's done a nice job so far in only year 3 with the program.
We talk about A-Rod as being a guy who could be obviously, he's come a long, long way. I think speaking of another guy who Kalani has over the years transferred that trust to as well, and I think that's the same way that he treats the offense is the same way that that he's kind of treated in that. But are guys like Fesi Sitake or even Aaron Roderick the possibility of going to another place, not as head coaches necessarily, although Fesi's name, I would hate to think that he couldn't be thought about as maybe being a Weber State guy. I mean, that's a guy. That's a place he's already coached. It's a place he's already had success. He's also a phenomenal recruiter. He knows the state, all those things. And so, is there danger of some of these other coaches making their way other places as well?
I think it's a great point on Fesi Sitake, because I don't think there's many coaches in the state that are better at identifying under-the-radar prospects like a Fesi Sitake. And when you're at Weber State, you've got to find those hidden gems. When no one believed in Dax Milne back in the day, he looked at Dax Milne and said, that guy's going to be a really good receiver, and he followed Fesi to BYU as a PWO, and then he became an NFL draft pick. So I think Fesi Sitake would make a ton of sense at a place like Weber State, and I think that, what he's shown at BYU, I mean, he's been there now since 2018. I mean, this is now 8 years at the program. It's been a long time, and I'm sure
I think he was
at
the first
some
one
point,
offered. Was he the first one to offer Zach Wilson too?
That one, he was involved with Zach Wilson when he was at Weber State, and then, of course, Kalani and that relationship when it came to the BYU side of things. It was kind of a, quick thing after Ty Detmer was let go and whatnot. But, yes, Fesi was on Zach very early on, too. So he is good at identifying under-the-radar, projecting players. And, yes, I think for an FCS program like Weber, that would make a ton of sense to get a guy like Fesi Sitake. But I think it's just always tricky in this landscape because, are you willing to also take on a job where it's not like when Jay Hill took that Weber State job where you can have some retention and maybe build something where you kind of know if you get good guys, you're going to lose them every single year. And that's more challenging than ever. You're kind of like, in some respects, like a JUCO, where you're always kind of flipping that roster unless, again, you've got some really high-level NIL and rev share commitments from your university. But, yeah, Fesi Sitake, Aaron Roderick, I think this whole staff, they've shown that these are a lot of coaches that are good enough to either be promoted, whether to be an offensive coordinator at some power conference or a head coach somewhere. This is a really good coaching staff that BYU has. It's a big reason why they've won 20 games since last season and are the winningest team in the Big 12 since last year.
I think it goes to show also it's a big reason why these head coaches now, Kalani fought for his assistants to get their compensation, to keep them around, to keep these guys, to make it harder for these guys to leave as well. Mitch, you talked about it being kind of gloomy out there in Cincinnati. It kind of feels like it's following this 2-game losing streak the Bearcats have. Is this Bearcats team as good as their record and their ranking was 2 weeks ago? Now that BYU's out there on the road, is this still going to look like a good win for the Cougars if they can get it done?
Definitely. I think it'd be a solid win to go on the road and beat a team that's only got 3 losses. I mean, Cincinnati's sound. I think they were not as good as maybe they looked with the record when they were beating up on maybe the bottom dwellers of the Big 12. Early on, the schedule was relatively light, but everyone that they faced outside of Iowa State, that's kind of been a top 40 team and a lot of advanced metrics they've struggled with. So I think this is a BYU team that should. I think they look like they've got the advantage in many respects in this matchup, and I think it would be a good win. I just think any win on the road, especially 2 time zones away, I think would be good. But we know that ultimately the committee doesn't value much with this BYU team and the way that they've built their resume. Even though you look at some of the advanced numbers on BYU, whether it's strength of record, whether it's game control, which historically has always been a good metric to get a barometer of where teams will be ranked. BYU's 14th in game control. It doesn't matter to the committee. They look at the Texas Tech loss and how BYU performed, and I asked the committee chairman point blank, like, why is BYU behind these two lost teams? And he immediately pointed to that performance and the way that BYU played against Tech. I disagreed with him in the stance that they got outclassed defensively. I thought BYU's defense proved that they can hang with top elite teams in college football, but the offense and special teams, yeah, they completely let BYU down, and it was a disappointing performance. But I'd like to think that if BYU can somehow get to Arlington, maybe they would show better. I don't know if they'd win. I still would have my doubts there, but I think they would make it a lot more competitive than what they showed in Lubbock in a game that was, probably the biggest home game in Lubbock in 20 years, and BYU didn't match that intensity and rise to the occasion, especially with the running back in LJ Martin, who wasn't completely healthy in that game. I'd like to see if LJ can stay healthy down the stretch run, if BYU can get to that game, how that matchup looks like if LJ is at full strength, because he wasn't a couple weeks ago.
So, and he talked a lot about how that Texas Tech game being maybe even just a tiny bit banged up, he just didn't have that confidence, right? The word confidence keeps coming up, and then he was able to kind of earn a lot of that back and had success against Texas Tech, or against, last week against TCU. What does it look like this week? How do they attack this Bearcat team? Because this is a Bearcat team that runs the ball well. They're almost to 200 yards a game, but they also have Brendan Sorsby, who prior to the last couple of weeks has been one of the most consistent passing quarterbacks in the Big 12. What does BYU have to do to beat that team? Is it just enough to follow like the blueprint that they saw against that Utah had against them here at Rice-Eccles, or what was it that Arizona did that was able to also push them in the direction of getting that win there at Nippert Stadium?
A lot of man press. That's been the kind of the talking point, the theme, that Cincinnati is having struggles passing the football against aggressive man press secondaries that challenge receivers, and they haven't got their top tight end either involved in recent weeks. Joe Royer, he's only had one catch in I believe the last two games, so that's been an issue for Cincinnati. And BYU, Jay Hill was asked about that this week, and he feels confident they've got the cornerbacks in the secondary to do that. And I agree. Trey Alexander and Evan Johnson, I think, have been really good this year. And then Jonathan Cabella, who quietly is really improving at that nickel spot. I mean, remember, his first game of this season was against Utah, and it's been kind of a slow build, but I think he's starting to play some of his best football of the season. He's only a sophomore for the Cougars, and then the safeties have been excellent. So I think BYU secondary is in a really good place. And I think, kind of follow a little bit of that blueprint that Utah did, because there's so many similarities defensively to how BYU and Utah operate. But they're going to be aggressive with these receivers. And I think BYU feels they've got the secondary to do that. I think offensively, BYU goes up against a Cincy team that runs a 3-3-5 scheme, a little bit different look, how they kind of go about their business defensively. But I think if BYU can run the football, I think that's going to be a good day for BYU, because Cincinnati is only 83rd nationally in stopping the run. TCU was a much better run defense than what Cincinnati poses, and BYU had a lot of success running the football. I'd like to think BYU continues to look like the team we've pretty much seen all but the Texas Tech game, where they are a balanced attack, but their foundation is running the football and getting LJ Martin going early and often. I think this is a game where you get LJ 30 touches, whether it's on the ground and in the receiving game, which we've seen more work for him in recent games. I think he's going to be the guy that you got to focus on for BYU, because if he gets going, I don't see Cincinnati slowing him down with what we've seen thus far from the Bearcats.
Mitch, we were looking at some of these games, of course, that are going to make a difference of what the future looks like for the college football playoff rankings in the next week. Oregon losing to USC there would be movement there. It might move USC way ahead in that playoff ranking. But I think that Missouri, who's ranked 22nd in the college football playoff, going to Norman, Oklahoma, that's a beatable Oklahoma team. If they lose a third game, are we just going through mental gymnastics that don't actually matter about teams that could lose in front of BYU in this thing, or in front of Utah in this college football playoff? And is it just really going to come down to can they win the Big 12 championship game if they can get there?
If Oklahoma loses, they'll be out. And the fact that Alabama dropped 6 spots last week after losing to Oklahoma, anyone can drop 6 spots, including even Texas Tech if we see a rematch between BYU and the Red Raiders down the road. I mean, I think Alabama getting dropped 6 spots I thought was pretty significant. And, that Missouri-Oklahoma game, I agree with you. I think that's the spot where maybe there could be a little bit of chaos. I don't get optimistic, though, because Missouri hasn't won in Norman since 1966. I mean, that's been a long time. It doesn't apply to this, but I think that Oklahoma's been really good this year. I think they're a really sound football team, and I think that's going to be tough for Missouri, who I'm not completely sold on. But if there is a spot to maybe create an opportunity for BYU to get into that top 10, that would probably be the spot. The USC-Oregon game is interesting because I fear that if USC gets that win, even though some of their advanced metrics are not better than BYU's, I just think that a win over Oregon, who has kind of got a light resume in their own right, they got a weaker strength of schedule than what BYU has to this point. But I think that could possibly leapfrog BYU and Utah if USC gets that win. And it's unfortunate because, I heard you guys earlier in the previous segments, like the same talking points about just winning and beating teams convincingly. We were talking about this in the Mountain West. This is a power conference league, the Big 12, and there's no respect given. It's going back to, again, you got to go undefeated, basically. You got to have just dominant performances. That's silly to me. I think that this league doesn't get enough respect for the quality of teams that they have, the quality of the personnel, and it's unfortunate that they have to be flawless in order to have a little bit of a wiggle room to operate. If you don't, you're completely sunk, and your odds of getting into the playoff are just destroyed. And maybe
does the eye test matter, Mitch? Do you think the eye test matter? Do teams have to? I don't want to call it running up the score, but not letting off the gas.
We call it style points, Mitch.
Does that matter?
Style points.
The eye test, I think, gets hurt for these Big 12 teams because eye test, I think, coincides a lot with what we're seeing with high school football. And you guys are seeing that right now.
Right.
The star ratings. When you look at the talent rosters, because these are humans looking at the committee, and they'll say, getting off the bus, the eye test of these teams, this team's got a talent rating by 24/7 Sports as a top 10 roster. BYU's talent composite is outside the top 50. And then they kind of factor into that stuff. And it's crazy because BYU just had a cornerback, Jackson Gates, who committed, and then he decommitted. He was a 3-star. He recently flipped to Missouri, coincidentally. Now, after days after flipping to Missouri, he's now a 4-star.
Right.
And Ryder Lyons is committed to BYU. He's now a 4-star after still a pretty productive season. And then you go, does that kind of play a role long-term? Because in the moment, you're like, whatever, it's a high school rating. But does that play into the thought process of eye test and style points? Because look at it with BYU basketball. They passed the eye test because they have 5 stars now. And, yes, they are legit talents and they got NBA guys. But I think that plays a role into the psyche and the mental views of this committee when you're sizing up eye test and then pairing it up with some advanced metric and the self-fulfilling of preseason SEC ranked teams are just beating up on ranked teams, and then they stay in those polls. It's challenging for these Big 12 teams to make any inroads when they really have good teams in this league.
Yeah.
Mitch Harper, BYU insider for KSLSports.com. He's live in Cincinnati. Nice enough to join us on a Thursday edition of the program. Mitch, have fun out there.
Mitch, go to UDF, United Dairy Farmers. They're like gas stations, but they have great ice cream. Like you go in there, you get a milkshake. I'm telling you, go to a UDF.
Okay, I will do that.
There's never look on a sports show. It's only been the most appropriate to give an ice cream recommendation for Mitch Harper. I mean, like, honestly, if you're going to do it,
there's also a place called Grader's, which is really good ice cream too.
Well, look, and I'll say I don't want to diss totally on the Skyline chili because it is chili and noodles, and we do that. Look, and then a ton of cheese on there. I would just say if you're going to be hanging out with other people, maybe nix the onions, and then you should be okay for the rest of the night. Mitch, thanks, man. We appreciate it. Have fun out there. We'll be following your coverage all the way here from Salt Lake.
You bet, guys. Take care.
There you go.
Thanks,
Mitch
Mitch.
Harper.